Welcome to FACT's webinar called Creative Leasing for Livestock Farmers. Our presenter is Esther Akwii. This webinar is hosted by Food Animal Concerns Trust. I am Larissa McKenna, FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating this evening's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. So as always, I have a few quick introductions. FACT is a national nonprofit organization that is headquartered in Illinois. We promote the safe and humane production of meat, milk, and eggs. I direct FACT's Humane Farming Program, which provides a number of opportunities for livestock and poultry farmers. And this webinar is part of our Humane Farming webinar series. So please visit our website to learn more about all of our farmer services, including our mentorship program, for which we're currently accepting applications, and the heaps of other webinars that we have coming up this winter. So this time I'm delighted to introduce our presenter, Esther Akwii. Esther is a lawyer with a keen interest in development law within the food and agriculture sector. She has experience working with livestock farmers on issues such as land tenure, climate change, and natural resource governance. She currently works with the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School in South Royalton, Vermont. Before this, she worked at the Animal Production and Health Division, the headquarters of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in Rome, Italy, where she researched and reviewed legislation and policy. So we are very, very lucky to have her with us this evening. And on that note, I am going to turn the floor over to Esther so she may get started with her presentation. So Esther, please take it away.
Thank you, Larissa, for that introduction. Before I start the webinar, I'll just start with a little disclaimer that the opinions and content presented during this webinar do not constitute legal advice. For legal advice, please consult a licensed attorney in your state. I'll start by introducing CAFS. CAFS is basically the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, found at the Vermont Law School in South Royalton. It was established in 2012, and it supports scholars, practitioners, and students in producing innovative research and legal tools for use by the food and agriculture community. We have several projects that have been implemented and also projects that are underway. But of specific relevance to this webinar is the Farmland Access Legal Project. Through this project, legal tools and resources were developed to help lower barriers to farmland access for new, small, and mid-sized farmers. The Farmland Access Legal Toolkit is one such tool that is geared towards farm seekers, landowners, and their advocates, and it offers information on affordable and equitable land access arrangements. And this web resource contains sections on leasing, farmland transfer, and innovative models of success. Most of the information from today's webinar is also found on the Farmland Access Legal Toolkit website. So moving forward, our webinar is split into three. So I'll start with the, going over leases, types of leases, and the basic terms that livestock farmers should consider. I'll discuss creative leasing arrangements, as well as legal resources that we have developed, like the Farmland Access Legal Toolkit, as well as how best to work with lawyers. So starting this off from the basics, what is a lease? A lease is an oral written agreement between a landowner and a tenant farmer. It grants the tenant farmer the right to use the farm property, and it's essentially a binding contract between the landowner and the farm tenant. We have two common types of leases, and either the oral stroke handshake deals or the written leases. I'll start by discussing the oral stroke handshake deals. So we have that many farming arrangements rest on handshake deals, which basically means that you're trusting another person's word. However, most often these handshake deals do fall through. And when you as a farmer, you're investing money, time, and other resources in a farm operation, it is generally a big mistake to rely on a lease agreement based on a handshake. these handshake agreements can be a mistake because they also often lend themselves to uncertainty and misunderstanding. For example, parties to a handshake lease might simply forget commitments they made. In our everyday tasks, we find ourselves, people have trouble remembering what they did or said. Now, imagine an agreement entered into orally, say 5 years ago. In case of a dispute, it's very difficult to, it becomes a situation of he said, she said, because you don't have something that is written down. And also, you as a prospective livestock farmer may invest in farmland, and then the landowner decides, that I no longer want farming on my land. Based on the handshake deal, then you will have trouble because, unfortunately, in most circumstances, handshake deals do not create a legally enforceable lease, and the law varies across the different states, but it's just not a wise decision to make. If the relationship sours, farmers without a written lease likely have no legal defense against eviction from the property. The second type of leases is, I'll give an example of Vermont where I'm based. We either have a letter of agreement or a written lease agreement. So for the letter of agreement, this is basically a letter from a farmer to the landowner that describes the operation or plans for the land in question and terms. It's usually written at the beginning of the year, and it explains the uses of the land for that season. Well, the advantage of a letter of agreement is that it's a written record, it's fairly quick and easy, but this also has a downside. If it's signed by only one party, since it's a letter, it may not be enforceable against the other person. It's just a letter you've sent to someone to tell them that I'm doing this. The second type of written lease is basically the lease agreement. As mentioned earlier, it's between a landowner and a tenant livestock farmer. In this case, with a formal description of the land, it identifies the parties and their signatures, terms and length of the lease, and any special provisions, which I'm going to discuss going forward. And it's often witnessed, it's notarized, and recorded. The advantage of this is that it's a written record of exact terms and conditions agreed upon by both parties, and it's effective against third parties as well, and if recorded. Well, the disadvantage is that for a new farmer who either doesn't have lots of capital at the start, then this may, involving an attorney in the process of drafting a lease, may turn out to be costly. So going forward, I'll just, the next part is going to focus on what the basic terms of a lease should be. What is the bare minimum? Starting off, the parties, the landlord and tenant names and the contact information. You have to ensure that this information listed is accurate. The correct individual or business names, the correct addresses, and the contact information. The other thing that you must look at is the details of the property. What property is being leased? Has the land been surveyed? Is a property map available and attached to the lease? Are the tenant, farm, and landowner clear on the property boundaries and uses? And how familiar are you with this land that you want to lease? The other aspect is the length. How long will this last? In regard to length, it depends on your farm operation. But then if we're to talk about dairy and livestock, typically you may need a longer lease because it takes longer to build the operation and make a profit out of it. So it's I don't think it would be wise to go for a lease, for example, 1 year. There isn't much that you can do in such a short period of time unless it's a renewable lease. The other basic term that you should consider is termination. What is the procedure to follow if a party wishes to end the lease early? Is there a required notice period that is fair to both the landowner and the tenant farmer? And can the parties terminate for any reason or just in specific situations described in the lease? And then rent. How will the rent be calculated and when will it be paid? because rent, especially for livestock farming, varies based on a number of factors. For example, the number of acres of land, the available forage, the number of livestock that may be grazed per acre, the type of livestock to be grazed, and then also, most important, what happens if rent is late or unpaid? So these, at the bare minimum, these are issues that you should, consider when you're when you want a lease drafted. But then I'll go into detail that, especially taking into account the requirements of a livestock farmer. The list will not be exhaustive, but at least these are some things that you should, consider to include in your list. I've already discussed the parties right after the rent, so I'll go straight to permitted activities. So another question that you should consider is what activities are permitted on the property and what is prohibited. Are any forms of agritourism allowed? You may want to hold farm diners or weddings or hay rides or tours on your farm. Is this something that is allowed? Would you need to pay additional rent to the landlord for you to be able to do this? And also, are these activities allowed under local laws or ordinances? As I said it earlier, different states have different regulations. The other thing that needs to be considered is directly related to permitted activities for livestock farmers is stocking limitations. Leases for livestock farming should set forth stocking limitations that address the number of head, breed, and the species of animals permitted on the land. And then repairs and routine maintenance. Both parties should discuss who is responsible for what repairs. And then the issue of what amounts to routine maintenance versus capital improvements, and who pays for what. Who owns capital improvements at the end of the lease term? Will the tenant be reimbursed for any capital improvements? Basically, the lease should discuss the right of the lessee to use any of the facilities on the property, including the buildings, barns, and houses. And in the instance that repairs are necessary, the lease should describe who will be responsible for undertaking repairs and for paying for it. Another issue to consider is insurance. What kind of insurance is required and how much, and which parties will maintain it? For example, if other livestock is present or in adjacent pasture, a landowner may also include a requirement that the lessee is liable for the death or injury of any livestock or damages to a third party caused by any livestock that escapes due to a gate being left open by the lessee or his employees. So as a livestock farmer, these are some of the things that, you should consider and, discuss based on, the type of animals that you'll be rearing. Also, disasters. Is there a disaster provision allowing the parties to terminate or modify the lease in case of a natural disaster, such as drought, fires, flood, a tornado, earthquake? Well, in this area of climate change, you cannot rule out anything. So is this something that you've discussed? This is something that you need to discuss if you're considering getting into a lease. And then there's indemnification. Is there an indemnification provision for both parties? This basically states that one or both parties agree to compensate the other for any loss stemming from their own actions of negligence. So who bears what? And then, just like any contract, disputes may arise. So in this case, is there a mediation or negotiation process that both the landowner and the livestock farmer can agree on in the case of a dispute? This is very important because these types of provisions help to limit the time and the expenses of a court action in the event of a dispute. Also, something that is important is the stewardship requirements, which means the efforts that the livestock farmer must make to ensure that the land is being used appropriately. It's important to ask if there are any stewardship requirements and costs relating to land. Who covers the stewardship costs, and which may range from annual inspections, to communications and sometimes reports from consultants. Does this farm come with a requirement, for example, to be USD organic certified? And who covers all those costs? Communication. What type of communication is required between the landlord and the tenant over the course of the lease? Will the landowner be coming for just annual meetings or inspections? How often will this be? And then also very important is the use of an attorney. Do you need an attorney to review or draft your lease? Can you, the livestock farmer and landowner, share the same attorney, or would you prefer that? Or would you prefer that the landlord and tenant each have an attorney? Also going forward, you need to consider it's important that the lease addresses the inspection of fences, especially for livestock farmers. In this regard, who would be responsible to inspect and repair fences, particularly where the leased property is near a highway? The lease should state which party will make these inspections and the frequency at which they should be made. There are lots of, I've gone through a long list because this is not exhaustive, and I have posed questions rather than given answers, because each farming situation is unique. And it's also likely that not all of these terms that I've briefly highlighted are necessary in every lease. So, you need to consider the facts of your particular situation and seek counsel from an attorney in your jurisdiction before entering into an agreement. When it comes to leasing, especially putting it into writing, you always have to imagine the worst case scenario, because it can happen. And in such cases, having a lease agreement that is clear will help to resolve issues. So having gone over what a lease is, what are the basic terms, I'm going to discuss creative leasing arrangements. So there are so many types of creative leasing arrangements, but for purposes of this webinar, it's just 1 hour. I'm going to just highlight 4 creative leasing arrangements. So what is creative leasing? So this is basically a way for the landowner and the tenant livestock farmer to creatively address their individualized needs and limitations. It provides unique and valuable benefits to farmers and landowners, such as the opportunity for the tenant livestock farmer to build equity in the leased farm, or the incentive to use environmental conservation measures in farm management. The extent of leasing arrangement is limited only by the imaginations of the landowner and the tenant farmer, and definitely by certain legal limitations. For purposes of today, I will just highlight 4 examples, which is ground leases, equity building provisions, lease to own arrangements, and leasing land with conservation easements. The choice of what is being discussed today is from the questions that participants raised at the time of registration, so we'll focus on this for today. So starting with ground leases, what are they? So basically, these are long-term leases that allow the farmer to rent only the farmland with the option to purchase and own existing buildings on the land and structures on a property. It basically means that the buildings and the structure are not leased, but only the underlying land is leased. This type of lease is usually long-term, and which means that it affords a certain amount of predictability and stability for livestock farmers, because they know they will have access to the leased land for long. Also, a long-term lease may be reviewed at regular intervals to reassess whether the lease continues to meet the needs of both parties, say every 5 years. The 2 benefits of ground leases, there may be others, but I'll focus on 2, is that they allow a farmer to build equity in the structures on the property while requiring less upfront capital. And also, it's a cheaper option because renting instead of buying land means no need for a down payment or a mortgage loan in most circumstances. And this is definitely a good option for beginner livestock farmers. However, the challenge with ground leases is that they raise a tricky issue about the value of any permanent buildings or other permanent improvements like fences that a livestock farmer may add to the land. Typically, the lease should provide some sort of system for the landowner to compensate the tenant livestock farmer for permanent improvements the farmer adds to the land, or could provide an option for the tenant farmer to purchase the property. For example, a farmer might lease 100 acres of farmland for 10 years. Over those 10 years, definitely a lot will go on. The farmer may build permanent improvements such as a processing barn. It's a permanent improvement because it's not designed to be removed from the land at the end of the lease and is therefore permanently attached to the land. When the ground lease ends and the tenant farmer leaves the property, the lease should ensure that the landowner pays the farmer for the value of such permanent improvements. Well, which brings us to the question as to how the value of permanent improvements can be determined. Basically, to determine the value of permanent improvements, and as a best practice, an appraisal can be done at the beginning of the lease and at the end of the lease. The increase attributable to the improvements built by the tenant farmer would be the value of the permanent improvements. An alternative mechanism to compensate the tenant farmer for permanent improvements could be the appraised value of these improvements, such as the processing barn minus any depreciation. But to sum up this example of how to handle the issue of value, there is no one way to value land. And so the best way to handle this situation is to work with a local extension agent in your state, and they should be able to help you figure out how best to handle this. The second type of leasing arrangement creative leasing arrangement I'm going to discuss is equity building provisions. So basically, equity refers to the value that has built up in a property, and equity in farmland can build because of the passage of time and the general increases in the value of property, or it can build because valuable things are added to the land, such as a processing barn in the case of livestock farmer. However, the challenge is that unless a lease says otherwise, equity in property always belongs to the landowner. An example, in the absence of a lease agreement, it means that if a tenant farmer builds a $50,000 barn, increasing the property value from $250,000 to $300,000, the tenant farmer will never recoup that $50,000 increase in equity. And of course, this is discouraging to tenant farmers, and definitely it's a situation that has discouraged them over time. And so landowners and farmers have come up with some creative leasing strategies to compensate tenants for investing in rented land. So an example of such arrangement is lease provisions that require tenants to be paid back for some of the investments that they make on the land. The benefit of this is twofold. It increases the incentive for the livestock farmer to invest in the rented land, and also the equity sharing arrangement benefits. And also the equity sharing arrangement benefits the landowner as well, because when tenants invest in improvements, both the farm itself and the lease arrangement have a better chance of being viable in the long term. However, when the third option that I'm going to look at today is lease to own. And for lease to own arrangements, they work in such a way that the incoming tenant farmer makes rental payments to the landowner to allow the tenant farmer to start working on the land and to start investing in eventual ownership of the property. The landowner continues to own the land until certain payments have been made or other prerequisites are met. And then the tenant farmer becomes the landowner. So this type of lease can be crafted in with different provisions that may include an option to purchase, or it may also include a right of first refusal. That means the ability to be the first in line to purchase when the property comes up for sale. The heart of a typical lease-to-own agreement, however, is that it incorporates the sale into the lease rather than presenting an option that may or may not be exercised. And such leases can be long-term, that's 10 to 99 years, or short-term, that is 1 to 10 years. But the advantage of this is that the lease-to-own arrangement allows the farmer to transfer land with flexible options. You have a test period and less debt, especially for an incoming farmer. Leasing for the purpose of permanently transferring ownership, though, over the long term, requires strong communication and a good working relationship between both parties, that is the landowner and the prospective livestock farmer, which takes us back slightly to the advantages of negotiation and making sure that all the terms of the lease are clear. The advantages of a lease-to-own arrangement is that it's definitely easier to find better, more suitable property to lease than to purchase. It's also a good way to start farming with less risk while still building equity. It also provides long-term security to both parties, so long as the relationship is strong and both parties follow the provisions of the lease. And it also enables economic and legal feasibility of constructing permanent structures. However, special considerations should be made before concluding a lease-to-own arrangement because they can be tricky. So if you are considering such an arrangement, you need to ask yourself some of the following questions. Will the landowner simply collect rent and move off the farm during the lease? Or will the landowner mentor the livestock farmer and have an active role in the management of the farm operation? How long should the lease be to allow both parties to generate enough income before the transition is complete? Will the landowner allow you, the livestock farmer, to continue to use any business name or label attached to the farm or the land? Will the landowner's agricultural equipment or livestock be included in the lease-to-own arrangement? And if so, how will this be executed? And also, where will the landowner and tenant farmer live? Is there room for both the landowner and the livestock farmer on the same farm? And basically, what will this landlord-tenant relationship look like? This is to ensure that, from the beginning, you have a clear understanding of what this entire arrangement entails. So the fourth leasing arrangement is leasing land with conservation easements. I'll just, starting off with a brief background, is that conservation in agriculture has been a national policy issue since the days of the Dust Bowl. And conservation is used to ensure that agricultural practices are environmentally sound and not degrading, to ensure that farm and ranch land is managed with care for future use. So how does a conservation easement happen? So basically it happens when the landowner sells or donates the conservation easement to a land trust or government agency. One such program that handles conservation easement is the USDA's Agricultural Conservation Easement Program that provides financial and technical assistance to help conserve agricultural lands and wetlands. States also may have conservation programs for farmers too, and this is why it's important to work with the local extension agents in the different states to find out what may be in place in addition to what is provided by the USDA. But the purpose of conservation easements is that they're used to protect a variety of conservation values like wildlife habitat, open space, agriculture, recreation, historic preservation, and public education. Once land has a conservation easement, the land value is the land value is usually lowered because it's no longer available for development due to the conservation easement. And this decreased value can make the land more affordable for potential lessee. However, leases with conservation easements are more complicated because they often will include a lot of the provisions required in the conservation easement. In some cases, the legal easement documents might be incorporated into the lease or attached to the lease. But a key benefit of land with conservation easements, as I mentioned earlier, is that you're able to access this land at a reduced rental price than land that would not be under conservation easement. So for prospective livestock farmer, one needs to ensure that they understand and can satisfy the requirements of any conservation easement that comes with the land, because the terms of an easement might limit, the livestock farmer's use of the property. So if you're considering this sort of arrangement, then you have to fully understand the restrictions on the land and how those restrictions might impact planned livestock operations before you sign the lease. An example of conservation terms that may be aimed at preserving the property is it may have a provision, for example, protecting the surface of the land from excavation, topsoil, and other mineral removal, or basically prohibiting any activities that are non-agricultural in nature. So it's very important to understand what exactly the easement entails before you consider it. So how do these conservation easements work? Full ownership of land comes with a variety of ownership rights. So that is the right to build homes and other structures, the right to minerals, the right of access, the right to timber, the right to exclude others from the property, and the right to rent or sell the property, or the right to subdivide the property, and the right to restrict the use of the land in certain ways. These property rights can be thought of as a sort of bundle of sticks. So a landowner can hold all these sticks in the bundle or transfer some of these sticks to others, which they can do through leasing. So when a conservation easement is in place, it takes several of the sticks in the bundle. After the conservation easement is in place, the landowner still has many of the sticks, such as the right to farm. But the conservation easement holder has other sticks, such as the right to limit commercial development in favor of conservation. Some examples of agricultural rights that you may also get, that may also come with a conservation easement, for example, is the right to establish, maintain, and cultivate fields and pastures in accordance with generally accepted agricultural practices. It also may come with the right to use, maintain, or establish and improve water sources and bodies within the property, or the right to use all-terrain vehicles on the property in the purpose of agriculture. So, basically going forward, a conservation easement is a property right, and it is transferred from the landowner to the conservation easement holder through a written deed called a conservation easement deed. So once this conservation easement deed is executed, it's recorded publicly within the land records. And once this is signed and recorded with the land records, it's binding on current and future landowners. So what does this mean for someone who's considering leasing land that is under conservation easement? It's important for you to note that conservation easements run with the land, meaning that they become a part of the chain of title and stay in effect even after ownership of the land changes. A new farmer leasing land with a conservation easement is bound by the terms of the conservation easement. And the new farmer is not allowed to negotiate new terms with the conservation easement holder. It means that the farmer leasing the land with a conservation easement should closely examine the conservation easement deed to make sure that they understand the limits and will be able to comply with them with undue economic harm. Because once you take it on, then you must comply with the requirements of the conservation easement deed. How is compliance achieved? Sometimes, in order to ensure compliance, the landowner may request to periodically visit the land to ensure that the tenant farmer is complying with the terms of the easement. And then, in case the livestock farmer, in this circumstance as an example, is violating, the conservation easement, you may receive a sort of notice notifying you of the fact that you're violating the conservation easement. You're not handling the land in the way that has been set, and they'll most probably give a time limit for having the violation rectified. And if you, the lessee, remain in violation, then the matter may end up in court, which definitely we want to avoid. But the gist is that you have to understand what exactly this land comes with, what is the baggage, and are you able to, to comply with the requirements of this easement. So, perspectives on creative leasing. I've looked at only 4 examples because of time, and as I said earlier, there's so many ways that creative leasing arrangements can be worked around. But the benefit of creative leasing is that it saves upfront costs and enables you, the livestock farmer, to recoup investments that you have made on the land. And also, it enables, for the landowner to retain control of the land. And in the instance that the lease is not renewed, then they're able to get their land back. But as maybe I've highlighted a bit, is that creative leases by their nature require more negotiation between the tenant farmer and the landowner upfront. And this results in longer and complex lease agreements. And it may also require more interaction between the livestock farmer and the landowner over the course of the lease period. Because of this complexity, such arrangements like creative leases may not be very appropriate for very new farmers still learning the art and science of agricultural production. Ideally, this is something that should be taken up by farmers with enough agriculture experience to root themselves in one place for decades to come, and perhaps also have the sufficient resources to hire experienced technical experts, such as lawyers and appraisers, to help them navigate this complex web of requirements that come with creative leasing arrangements, and to make sure that they don't end up on the wrong side at the end. So basically, for this first part, I've just gone over types of leases, what you need to consider, especially for a livestock farmer, and then the 4 examples of creative leasing arrangements. If most of this information is available on the Farmland Access Legal Toolkit website, which is on www.farmlandaccess.org. And so if you go there after this, you'll get more detailed examples of how best to work around this. So the third part of this webinar is about how to work with an attorney. How can they help you? Legal issues can arise at any stage of a farm lease cycle. And it's important to work with a lawyer. They can protect the time, money, and energy that you've invested in your farm business. They can help you think through likely future scenarios, both good and bad. So you should, a livestock farmer should think of consulting one right from when they're thinking about starting a farm business, looking for land, when you're negotiating a lease, in the instance that you've drafted your own families, maybe it would be wise to involve one to go over the terms that you've drafted or the other party has drafted and given to you. Also, in the instance that a dispute arises during the course of the relationship, then lawyers may help you navigate some of these issues that may come up. And then in the instance that, the relationship falls apart, they may help to avoid the livestock farmer from getting evicted from the land. And, if in the worst case scenario there's a lawsuit or a court order, then definitely, an attorney is required in such circumstances. But also in case you want to end the lease agreement, then it's also good to work with one to help you navigate any curveballs that may arise from you wanting to end a lease term, either at the end or early, and to kind of sort out some of the issues we discussed when it comes to capital improvements and recouping some of the investments that you, the livestock farmer, may have made on the land. So in the instance that you decide that you need legal advice for your farm business, there are some places to start looking. And the first is to talk to other farmers. You may know other farmers with similar operations, such as yours, in this case, other livestock farmers. And they may have hired lawyers. And so definitely they are a great source for lawyer recommendations for lawyers who are experienced in dealing and working with farmers. The other option is to ask a trusted farm organization. Most of these organizations often know which lawyers frequently work with farmers, and they can help to recommend either the right lawyer for the job or someone to call for a recommendation. The other option is to ask another lawyer. You may know, for example, a criminal lawyer, but then that criminal lawyer may know a lawyer who actually works with farmers. So that is also a good starting point. And then if you happen to be, for example, in Vermont, where I am, you could call a law school clinic that has clinical programs that are dedicated to food or farming. And these can be a good source of referrals to local or national farmer-friendly attorneys with experience in the area. And then also a very good resource that is in-state is your state's bar association. So most often on the website, you'll find a directory of lawyers who are licensed in your state, or a phone number you can call to ask for lawyer referrals. Often the state directories will have information about specific practice areas such as agriculture law, business law, litigation, and they'll help you navigate and find out who exactly to call. Most of the information, as I've said, I've provided is general, and in case you need specific legal information, then this is a very good place to start to help navigate based on the current needs that your farm or that you would want to look at. It's not been possible to cover everything about leasing in one webinar. As I started off at the beginning, that we have the Farmland Access Legal Toolkit at farmlandaccess.org. And this toolkit explains legal arrangements that provide farmers more affordable and equitable farmland access. It has information on leasing resources. It has state-specific leasing issues and more information on creative leasing, and also some additional topics such as collaborative farming, federal conservation programs, land trusts, and also issues like option to purchase at agriculture value, among others. It's quite detailed, and if you join the webinar through online rather than calling in, then I have like a screenshot of what the website looks like, so that you can, when you get it, like, oh, I'm in the right place, and also the web link. In addition, The toolkit has 19 case studies or farmer stories that illustrates how different farmers across the country have navigated these farmland access issues, uh, farm transfer, and also the strategic use of conservation tools to, enhance the affordability of farm access and transfer, and how to keep their land in farming. And then maybe just to wind up this presentation, in the offing is a free online families tool as part of the Farmland Access Lego project, titled the Families Builder, and it's under development and will also be available on the same webpage in the coming months. So it should be able to provide most of the the information in form of a tool that I have briefly highlighted in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther. We really appreciate that fantastic presentation, and really thinking through the questions that came in ahead of time and being able to kind of react to those. I'm just going to read through a couple comments that came through. I want to make sure everyone knows that this presentation, the slides, and the recording will be available probably tomorrow. I'll be sending those out. And I'll also send some of the links in particular, of course, the legal toolkit, legal access, or farmlandaccess.org. I'll make sure that you all have that. And I'm just going to give you a moment, Esther, if you want to read through anything that's come in through the chat bar. But so there was a comment that when we were talking about the pieces of the basic terms of the lease, two things that were mentioned that perhaps also to consider would be subletting. That might be something that would come up. And then also someone mentioned that there are opportunities for cost shares, that farm owners may be, interested in putting in a public access to their farms, and that the livestock, the tenants, may not want public access to the animals. So finding out, what those situations are, and if that's, something that's happening on that particular property is also, of course, something that to keep in mind and to figure into a lease.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Larissa. To respond to the question of subleasing, again, it depends on the sort of negotiation that you may have undertaken with the landowner, whether this is something that is allowed or is restricted.
Right. Exactly. Kind of figuring that out in advance is essential. In the Farmland Access Toolkit, are there example leases that are available for folks to look through?
So the Farmland Access Legal Toolkit has it's divided in 3 or 4 sections. So there's a section that talks about leasing exclusively, and this focuses, as I said, it has questions to consider before signing a lease. It has different leasing resources. For example, different models that have been used, links to other resources out there that will be relevant in the different states. For example, we have a link to agricultural lease resources in California. We have a toolbox for leasing farmland by Land for Good. We have information that has been put together by the different land grant universities, pertaining to leasing in the different states. So there's quite a bit of information that is on the website that should be able to answer most of the specific questions that the participants may have. And then we have this whole section that talks about state-specific leasing issues. So the allowed number of years, acceptable agriculture practices on agritourism, protection for tenants, lease termination notice rules, requirements for valid families, and all this. Most of the information that I discussed, like handshake deals, and then we have a whole section that talks about farmer wisdom. So what do experienced farmers have to say about creative leasing, or how have they navigated some of these? What are the experiences? What advice would they give going forward to anyone who wanted to get into arrangements similar to what they had? And then also the very important part is the 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 section on how to work with the farm lawyers. So this basically has information on why you should work with a lawyer, what a lawyer costs. I didn't go into the details of this because if you go to a lawyer, well, it depends on how you negotiate with them, but then what kind of fees do they charge? How to find a lawyer, which I briefly talked about. What do you look for in a lawyer? How do you know that they actually, what questions should you ask before choosing a lawyer to help you with your farming business? And then also concerns about working with lawyers. How this has also been addressed. And then also the most important, how to get the most out of working with a lawyer.
Right.
Yes. And also important links to some farm lawyers. So there's quite a bit of resource out here.
So I know that we're not going to be able to answer everyone's questions, and they'll probably be, and some of them might be better offline just because of the more detailed nature of the question. So just I do want to share just a couple of things before we sign off today. So immediately following the webinar, there will be a very brief survey. If you could take a moment or two just to complete it, tell us about your experience, and you can use that feedback for future webinars. Let me just forward the screen. And as I mentioned, also a recording and the slides will be available soon. They will be emailed out to all of you and documented and archived on our website. So I'd also like to just flag a couple more webinars that we have coming up this winter. We have one next week about the New Zealand method of sheep shearing. So if you'd like to join us for an overview of the technique, the tools, the importance of shearing, and the humane treatment of fiber-bearing animals, we would love to have you next. I believe it's next Tuesday. And finally, in case you haven't heard, FACT is currently accepting applications to participate in our Humane Farming Mentorship Program. It's a year-long phone-based program that's designed for livestock and poultry farmers who wish to raise their animals on pasture using sustainable methods. If you are a newish farmer who's seeking personalized guidance on business strategies and or animal management practices, or an experienced farmer who has a knack for teaching, you may wish to apply. It's very flexible and is tailored to meet individual needs and goals for the people that are interested in participating. The application deadline is coming up next week on January 31st. So before we close, I'm just going to ask, Esther, do you have any parting thoughts before we sign off?
Thank you, Larissa. I have seen a number of questions here. But unfortunately, I cannot answer. But as I've recommended, please visit the Farmland Access Legal Toolkit on www.farmlandaccess.org. I promise you, it's going to answer most of your questions. It has all these sections that what I'll give you will just be, on the surface, but this will be more detailed. So it's definitely a resource to use for anyone who's interested in leasing land for livestock farming.
Excellent. Very good. Yes, I'll definitely include that link in the follow-up email. So I'm afraid that is all the time we have for tonight. Sincere thank you to you, Esther, for your great presentation and personalizing it for our questions. It's been a real honor and pleasure to have you. And thanks to all of you in our audience for your attention and interest. I hope that you have a wonderful evening and that we're able to connect again soon. Goodbye.